I've done this work for almost 9 years, and I've learned that the worst part isn't the smell. People always assume it's the smell. And yeah, sometimes it's bad, especially in summer, especially if nobody checked on a property for a while after the bank took it back. But you get used to that. You put on a respirator, you crack windows, you do the job. The smell fades. The worst part is the personal stuff. People don't take everything when they leave a foreclosure. Sometimes they don't take anything. You walk into a house where someone lived for 15 years and they just stopped. Left a full pantry. Left a kid's drawings on the refrigerator held up by magnets shaped like fruit. Left a wedding photo on the hallway wall because maybe they couldn't look at it anymore. Or maybe they left so fast that the nail was a problem for another day that never came. You bag all of it. You box it, catalog it, haul it out. The bank doesn't care what it is. The bank cares about square footage and condition reports, and whether the water damage on the second floor constitutes a material defect. I've gotten better at not looking too closely. That's the honest truth. You develop a kind of selective vision after enough years of it. You see the work, not the life. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand the headspace I was in when I went to the Carver Street property. I wasn't some rookie who still got emotional about a stranger's leftover Christmas ornaments. I was a professional with 9 years of practice at specifically not thinking too hard about what I was handling. And it still happened. My name is Dale Whitmer. I'm 41. I own a small property services company out of central Pennsylvania, Whitmer. Clean and clear, which sounds more impressive than it is. It's me, my employee Marcus, who does the heavy hauling and drives the bigger truck. And depending on the job, 1 or 2 guys I pull in per diem from a labor pool I've used for years. We do foreclosure cleanouts, estate sales prep, sometimes post-eviction work for landlords who need a unit turned around fast. It's not glamorous. It pays the mortgage, barely. And after the years I've had, it's enough that I stopped needing it to be more than that. I want to be up front. I'm not prone to strange experiences. I've never seen a ghost. I don't believe in that kind of thing in any active way. It's not something I've spent time thinking about. I mention this because I think it's relevant. The kind of person I am is the kind of person who, when a door swings shut by itself, looks for a draft. The kind of person who hears a sound in an empty house and spends 20 minutes figuring out whether it's the pipes or a small animal before he considers anything else. That's just how I'm wired. The Carver Street job came through a bank contact I'd worked with for years. Her name is Renee, property disposition coordinator for a regional branch, and she's given me maybe 40 or 50 jobs over the years. The referral came in a standard email, single-family residential, 4BR/2BA, vacant since February, estate case rather than straight foreclosure. The owner died with no next of kin on record, and the property had passed to the bank through an intestate process. Renee flagged it as a possible 2-day job because of volume. No specific notes beyond that. I drove out on a Tuesday in late April. The address was in a neighborhood I'd worked in before, older residential stock, built mostly in the 70s. Decent-sized lots. The houses on Carver Street were the kind where you could tell they'd been nice once, and then time had just worn them down quietly. The way it does, not dramatically, not with sudden catastrophe, just slowly enough that nobody noticed the moment things crossed the line. The house was a 2-story colonial, vinyl siding that had been white once, 2 big oak trees in the front that had cracked the walkway in several places. The yard was overgrown, but not wildly so. Maybe 2 months of neglect. There was still a welcome mat at the front door, one of those coir mats with the word "home" in blocky letters. I photographed it for the intake report and then stepped over it. Marcus had the lockbox code from Renee's office, and had the door open by the time I finished my exterior notes. He's a good worker, Marcus. Doesn't talk too much. Doesn't make a big deal out of the grimmer stuff. He's built for this work in a way that I think is partly personality, and partly the fact that he came to it late in life, after enough other hard things that a stranger's empty house doesn't register as particularly significant. The interior was dim. All the blinds were drawn. Those old aluminum Venetian blinds that let in thin strips of light, but mostly just make everything feel underwater. The entry hall had a coat rack with 3 coats still on it, a shoe rack with 4 pairs of shoes, a small table with a dish of coins, and 2 keys on a ring that didn't appear to go to anything in the house. Standard stuff. I started my room-by-room intake. Living room. Furniture still in place. A couch and 2 armchairs. A television set that was at least 15 years old on a pressed wood entertainment unit. The walls had rectangular lighter patches where pictures had hung, which meant the previous owner had taken the pictures at some point, whether before they died or in a lucid period. I couldn't say. Dining room. Table and 6 chairs. A sideboard with a partial set of dishes still inside. Kitchen. Food cleared from the counters, but cabinet contents still intact. Dishes, pots, pantry goods. This was a normal intake. Nothing unusual. Marcus started in the basement while I moved upstairs. The second floor had a short hallway with 4 doors. Master bedroom, a bathroom, a small room that had been used as a home office, and at the end of the hall, a 4th room with the door pulled mostly shut. I started with the master because it's usually where the most time-consuming stuff accumulates: clothing, bedside items, personal documents that need to be flagged for the attorney handling the estate. The master here was sparse. A double bed, a dresser, a nightstand with a glass of water that had evaporated down to a white ring. The closet had men's clothing, older styles, everything clean. The nightstand drawer had the usual: a few pens, a pocket calendar from 3 years ago, a box of antacids, a reading glasses case. I worked through the room methodically, made my notes, and moved to the office. The office was cluttered in the specific way that home offices get when someone uses them, only occasionally stacks of paper that seem important, and then aren't. Old catalogs, a printer still plugged in, a mug of dried-out pens. Nothing significant. The bathroom. Then I pushed open the door at the end of the hall. I remember this clearly. I pushed it open, and my hand was already reaching for the light switch before I was even fully inside. Muscle memory from 1,000 rooms just like this one, and the overhead light came on, and I stood there in the doorway for what I think was a long time. The room was a child's bedroom. That's not unusual in a 4-bedroom house. It's what you'd expect. But here's the thing. I grew up in a house about 30 miles from here. My parents bought it in 1988, the year I was born, and they sold it in 2004 when my father got a job offer in Ohio, and they moved. I grew up in that house from birth to 16. I haven't been back to it since the sale. As far as I know, I have no strong feelings about it one way or another. It's a house I used to live in. Those are fairly ordinary facts about my fairly ordinary childhood. The room at the end of the hall was my bedroom. Not a room like my bedroom. Not a room that reminded me of my bedroom. Not a room with similar furniture or a similar layout. My bedroom. The same twin bed frame, that particular dark wood. The headboard with the slight forward lean where one of the bolts had never sat right. The same dresser. The same white melamine finish with the long drawer pull on the top drawer that wobbled when you opened it. The same desk, pressed wood, with the same kind of cheap rolling chair. The same wallpaper. A pale blue background with a repeating pattern of small geometric shapes that I remembered was called something like maritime or compass point. I can't remember exactly. but the pattern, the specific shade. I'll be honest with you, my first thought was that I was misremembering, that the furniture was similar, and I was filling in details from memory. That's the rational thing to think. I walked in and stood in the middle of the room, and I looked at it the way I'd been trained to look at things specifically, not generally. I looked at the dresser. There's a thing my father did when they assembled furniture. He always put the Allen wrench in the top left drawer when he was done. As a kind of unconscious habit, it drove my mother crazy, and she'd move it to the junk drawer in the kitchen every time. But he kept doing it. I don't know why I thought of that. I pulled open the top left drawer. It was empty. Of course it was. But the drawer wobbled exactly the way my drawer had wobbled, the small rocking motion from the guide rail being slightly misaligned. I knew the feeling of that wobble. I'd opened that drawer thousands of times. I stood there for another minute. Then Marcus called up from the basement that one of the utility shelves had collapsed, and I should come down and look at the situation. And I went. I didn't say anything to him about the room. I don't know exactly why. Maybe because I hadn't decided yet what there was to say. I helped him sort out the collapsed shelf. We broke for lunch. We drove to a diner about a mile away and ate sandwiches and talked about a baseball game that had been on the radio that morning. I let myself be quiet. When you've worked physical jobs long enough, you learn to value silence during the break. Marcus has never once asked me why I'm quiet. That's one of the things I appreciate about him. After lunch, I went back upstairs. I told Marcus to start on the living room. I stood in the doorway of the room again for a while before I went in. Here is what I noticed on the second look, with more time and more deliberate attention. The wallpaper pattern. I was right about it, I was sure enough. The furniture arrangement was the same. Bed against the left wall, desk under the window, dresser between the closet and the corner. The closet was the same folding door style. The window looked out over the backyard and had the same kind of latch hardware, a simple lever type, though that was common enough that I didn't count it. What I counted was the scuff. On the baseboard under the window, there was a black scuff mark, roughly boot-shaped, low on the white baseboard paint. I'd made a mark exactly like that in my own room. I was around 12. I'd been climbing out the window onto the back porch roof, and I'd slipped, getting back in and kicked the baseboard hard enough to leave a mark my mother never fully repainted. She just touched it up with the wrong shade of white, and it was always slightly visible, a faint outline under a thin coat. The scuff in this room was the same shape, in the same place. I crouched down and looked at it for a long time. It had been touched up with a slightly different shade of white, just like mine. My handwriting isn't something I think about much, but I know what it looks like. You recognize your own script the same way you recognize your own voice on a recording with a slight delay. And then certainly, I hadn't written anything in that room as a child that I could immediately remember. But when I opened the closet to begin inventorying it, on the inside face of the doorframe, low down near the floor where a kid would crouch to be hidden, there were small pencil marks, height tracking marks, the kind parents make. The kind I had in my closet at home too, though mine had been done on the wall inside the closet itself, not the doorframe. These were on the doorframe, different from mine in that specific detail. But the measurements were roughly right for my age, and the handwriting on the labels, the tiny printed dates next to each mark. I held my phone flashlight up to them for a long time. I'm not saying it was my handwriting. I'm saying I couldn't rule it out. And that's a sentence that took me the better part of a week to be able to say, without feeling like something was wrong with me. I finished the room's inventory that afternoon on autopilot. Box the clothes from the closet, note the furniture for removal, photograph everything, tag the boxes. The mechanical part of my brain handled it. The other part kept running back over what I was seeing and checking it against what I remembered. I drove home that evening later than usual. The Carver Street property was a 2-day job, and I was due back in the morning to finish. I sat in my kitchen for about an hour without turning the television on. I tried to think through it cleanly. Identical furniture is possible mass-produced stuff from the same era, the same stores, the same catalog. Identical wallpaper is possible. Identical furniture arrangement is possible. The scuff and the touch-up paint coincidence, maybe. Kid-height scuffs on baseboards under windows are probably more common than I'm giving them credit for. The height marks with handwriting I couldn't positively identify either way. By itself, any one of those things was explainable. Together, they added up to something I had no category for. I went to bed. I didn't sleep well, which is unusual for me. I'm generally out within 10 minutes of lying down. That's just how physical workdays go. That night, I was awake until well past midnight, looking at the ceiling of my actual bedroom in my actual house, thinking about a room I'd stood in that afternoon that felt, in some way I couldn't quantify, like looking at the inside of my own memory. In the morning, I drove back to Carver Street, and I didn't tell Marcus anything, except that I wanted to spend more time on the upstairs before we cleared it. He shrugged and went back to the living room, and I went upstairs alone. The first thing I did was take measurements. I keep a 50-foot tape measure in my work bag standard equipment. I use it constantly for room assessments, furniture dimensions, estimating hall volume. I measured the room on Carver Street carefully, wall to wall, floor to ceiling. Then I sat in my truck and pulled up the county property records on my phone, the public assessor database I use regularly for square footage verification. The Carver Street house was in there. The second-floor bedroom at the end of the hall was listed as 11 feet, 2 inches by 12 feet, 4 inches. I'd measured my childhood bedroom once, when I was maybe 13 or 14. I remembered it because I'd been trying to figure out if a full-size bed would fit, and I'd written the numbers on a piece of paper that I kept in my desk drawer for weeks before I lost it. 11.2 by 12.4. I remembered being slightly disappointed because it wasn't quite big enough for the arrangement I'd wanted. I sat in the truck for a while after that. The assessor record would reflect the house as built, as permitted. This was a development neighborhood, 70s construction. It was entirely possible that several houses on this street and the streets around it shared the same floor plan, the same room dimensions, pulled from the same builder's template. That's how these neighborhoods worked. My parents' house in Dillsburg was the same kind of construction, same era. I couldn't remember the name of the development. I couldn't remember if there were other houses that looked like ours from the outside. That was the rational frame, and I held on to it. I went back inside. I spent most of that second morning doing what I should have done the day before, which was look at the house as a house, instead of fixating on one room. I went through the office paperwork more carefully. The deceased's name, according to Renee's intake file, was Gerald Maurer, 73 years old. No surviving family on record. I found his name on a few pieces of mail in the office utility bills, a prescription notice, a letter from a veterans organization. The handwriting on a notepad beside the phone was an old man's handwriting, cramped and slanted. Not mine. I photographed it anyway. The living room had nothing that surprised me. The kitchen had a wall calendar from 2 years ago, the generic kind with landscape photographs, still open to August. I noted it, photographed it, moved on. What I kept coming back to, mentally, was provenance. Where had the furniture in that back room come from? The bed frame and dresser and desk, they were the kind of things that people moved from house to house across decades, acquired in one era and carried forward because they still functioned, because replacing them was an expense you deferred indefinitely. It was entirely plausible that Gerald Maurer had owned that furniture for 30 years, that he'd bought it from a store in the 80s or early 90s, the same store my parents had bought ours, that it was a common model. The wallpaper was harder to explain that way. Wallpaper was a choice. You picked a pattern, you hung it, it stayed until someone stripped it. The chance that two different people in two different houses had chosen the same pattern, the same colorway, seemed lower. Not impossible. Lower. I pulled a section of the wallpaper near the closet door, where it had started to lift at the seam. Just a small section, just enough to see if there was anything underneath. Sometimes you find layers in these old houses, 4 or 5 generations of wallpaper going back decades. There was one layer underneath, a darker paper, green, a simple stripe. So the blue geometric pattern was the second layer. Someone had put it up over the original. Gerald Maurer or a previous owner, I had no way to know. By mid-morning, Marcus had cleared most of the downstairs and was asking about the furniture schedule. We'd need to figure out what the bank wanted hauled versus what could be donated, and that required a call to Renee. I stepped outside to make the call and stood in the backyard while it rang. The backyard was deeper than it looked from the front. A wooden fence at the property line, the paint faded to a bare gray. A small concrete patio off the back door. There had been a garden at some point, raised beds, now just soil and dried stems. I looked up at the back of the house while Renee's extension rang, and I saw the window of the room at the end of the hall. Second floor, right corner. I had climbed out that window. My window. Or a window that occupied the exact same position on a house with the exact same dimensions. I'd gone out onto the roof of the back porch to sit with a flashlight and read when I was supposed to be asleep. My father knew and pretended he didn't. It's one of the few memories I have that I think of as simply good, without any complicated feelings attached to it. Renee picked up and I had a normal conversation about disposal schedules, and she told me the estate attorney wanted a full furniture inventory before anything moved, which pushed our timeline out by a day. I said that was fine. I went back inside. I told Marcus we had an extra day, and he said that was fine too. He had a way of absorbing schedule changes without any visible reaction, which had always suited me. He asked if I wanted him to start on the upstairs. I told him to finish documenting the basement, and I'd handle the upstairs myself. He gave me a look. Not a suspicious look, more the look he gives when he's noticed something, but decided it isn't his business. Then he went down the basement stairs, and I went up. I sat on the floor of the room at the end of the hall with the door closed, and I tried to do something I'm not naturally good at, which is remember. Not the general shape of my childhood bedroom, but the specifics. I'm not someone who walks around with clear memories of being a kid. I know people who can describe a room from 30 years ago in precise detail, every poster on the wall, every crack in the ceiling. I'm not like that. I have impressions. I have a few vivid fixed points and a lot of blur. The blur was the problem here, because the room I was sitting in kept wanting to be more specific than my memory was. The wallpaper pattern, was I sure that was the exact same pattern? Or was I layering my memory of the pattern over what I was seeing, adjusting my recollection to match the present rather than comparing them independently? That's a real cognitive issue. Eyewitness testimony is unreliable for exactly this reason. Memory is reconstructive. I knew that. But I also knew the wobble in the drawer, and I knew the scuff mark. I opened the closet again and looked at the height marks on the door frame. There were 6 of them, covering what looked like 3 or 4 years of increments, the dates written in the same small printed hand. The last date was in pencil, barely legible. I photographed it with my phone and then expanded the image. The handwriting on the date label looked like mine. I know I said I couldn't rule it out, and I'm saying it again because I'm still not certain enough to go further than that. It looked like mine. That's as far as I'll take it. None of the marks were named. Most parent-made height records include a name the kid's name to distinguish between siblings. These had no names, just dates and measurements. I checked the dates against a rough timeline. If the marks began when the child in question was approximately 5 or 6 years old, which is when these things typically start, the dates placed the earliest mark at a year that corresponded to when I was 5. The gaps between marks and the progression of the measurements fit a normal growth curve for a child my age at those years. I sat with that for a long time. There's a way that evidence accumulates that isn't the same as proof. You can have 6 things that each have a reasonable individual explanation, and the reasonable explanations don't stop being reasonable just because there are 6 of them. But at some point, the weight of coincidence starts to feel like something else. You can't say what the something else is. You just feel the weight shift. That afternoon, I drove 30 miles to Dillsburg. I want to be clear, I hadn't been back to my parents' old neighborhood in years. My parents were in Ohio, had been since I was 16. I had no ties to the area. I drove there because I wanted to stand in front of my childhood house and look at it and see if it was the same exterior as the Carver Street house, if these were even the same floor plan, if I was chasing a coincidence that could be settled by looking at 2 houses side by side. The street I grew up on was called Fenwick Drive. I remembered the name. I pulled up the GPS and drove. Fenwick Drive was still there. The neighborhood still looked the way I remembered, the same basic housing stock, the same slightly weary quality. I found the house, or what I thought was the house. I'll be honest, I second-guessed myself twice before I settled on the right number. It had been repainted, and there was a newer fence and different plantings, but the shape of it was right. 2-story colonial, 2 oak trees in the front, concrete walkway. I parked across the street and sat in my truck for a while. The exterior was not identical to Carver Street. The siding color was different. The front door was different. The porch layout had been modified at some point. But the roof line was the same. The window placement was the same. The 2 oak trees I'd forgotten there had been 2 oaks, but there they were, in roughly the same positions as the ones at Carver Street, though larger here, older. I could see the upper right window from where I parked. That would be the room at the end of the hall. The window had curtains now, some kind of thick drape, the room being used as a proper bedroom. A child's bicycle was locked to the porch railing, which meant the house had a family in it, and I was a grown man sitting in a truck across the street, staring at their window, which meant I needed to leave. I drove back. On the way home, I stopped at a diner and ate dinner alone and thought through what I had. 2 houses built in the same era, with the same floor plan, not surprisingly, given that these were development neighborhoods. Room dimensions that matched because the floor plan matched. Furniture of the same era and style that could have been purchased at any number of stores. Wallpaper that I was willing to acknowledge I might be misremembering. A scuff mark in a plausible location that any kid in any similar room might have made. Height marks in a door frame with dates that could fit any child's timeline if you were willing to be approximate about it. The handwriting. I kept not being able to file the handwriting away. When I got home, I looked for something in my own handwriting from when I was a child. This is harder than it sounds. I'm not someone who kept diaries or saved schoolwork, and my parents had moved twice since I was 16, and the boxes from my childhood, whatever was in them, were in Ohio. I called my mother that evening, which I did every couple of weeks anyway, and I talked to her for 20 minutes about the usual things. And then at the end, I asked her if she had any of my old school stuff. papers, anything with my handwriting as a kid. She was quiet for a second. Then she said she thought she had a box somewhere in the spare room. She wasn't sure what was in it. She'd have to look. I told her there was no rush, just whenever she had a chance. She asked if everything was okay. I said yes. I asked about my father. She told me about a home improvement project he'd started and then abandoned, which was a reliable ongoing story in their lives, and we said goodnight. After I hung up, I opened the photographs I'd taken in the room that day. I went through them methodically, the way I go through intake documentation, looking at each image for what was actually there, rather than what I expected to see. In one of the photographs, the one I'd taken of the desk from across the room, there was something on the surface of the desk I'd cataloged as empty. A faint rectangular impression in the dust, the size and shape of a book. Or a notebook. I hadn't found a notebook in the room. I'd inventoried the closet, the dresser, the desk drawers. I went back through my notes. No notebook listed. I'd cleared the desk surface myself. I remembered sweeping my hand across it to check for anything under the dust. I hadn't felt a notebook. But the impression was there in the photograph, fresh-edged, the dust around it undisturbed, which meant the impression hadn't been there long. Something had sat on that desk recently enough to leave a clean outline in the surface dust. And then it had been removed. I zoomed in on the photograph until the image degraded. The impression was real. Not a trick of the light, not a smear from my own hand. A clean rectangle, the corners defined, roughly the size of a standard composition notebook, the kind I'd used in school. Marcus had been in the basement all afternoon. I'd been in the room alone. I set the phone face down on the kitchen table and sat there for a while. I went back to Carver Street the next morning alone. I didn't tell Marcus I was going. I texted him that I needed to do a solo walkthrough for the estate attorney documentation, which was partially true. Renee had sent a follow-up email the previous evening, asking for room-by-room photographs with measurement annotations, the kind of detailed inventory that banks want before they list a property. So I had a legitimate reason to be there alone with a camera and a tape measure. I used it. The house felt different in the morning without Marcus. Quieter, but not in a peaceful way. More like the quiet of something waiting. I know how that sounds. I'm aware of how that sounds. I'm telling you what I noticed, not what I concluded. The room was unchanged. Of course it was. I'd half expected the impression in the desk dust to be gone, filled in or smeared somehow, but it was still there, still clean-edged, still exactly the size I'd photographed. I stood over it for a minute, and then I did the estate documentation I'd come to do, moving systematically through every room, photographing and measuring, making myself work before I let myself investigate. That's a discipline I've built over years. Finish the job before you follow the curiosity. It's kept me professional on days when I didn't particularly feel like being professional. It took about 90 minutes to complete the documentation properly. Then I went back to the room. I went through it again, completely. Not the quick inventory pass I'd done before, but a real search. The kind where you move furniture and check underneath. Where you take everything out of the closet and feel along the back wall. Where you pull the dresser forward and look behind it. I know how to search a room. I found plenty of things in these houses that people believed were gone cash in envelopes taped inside dresser drawers. Jewelry and socks pushed to the back of shelves. Documents behind wall fixtures. People hide things, and then forget they hid them, or they die before they can retrieve them. It's one of the realities of this work. Behind the dresser, there was a layer of dust and a quarter and a pen with a chewed cap. Nothing else. Under the bed, there was a flat storage box, the kind that slides under on wheels, the plastic yellowed and brittle looking. I pulled it out. Inside was a folded spare blanket, 2 pillowcases, and at the very bottom, a composition notebook. The black and white marbled cover, standard size, the kind that costs $1.50. My hands were steady. I want to note that. My hands were steady, and I sat on the edge of the bed and I opened it. The first page had a name written inside the front cover, the way teachers used to tell you to do in elementary school. The handwriting was a child's handwriting. Uncertain, slightly oversized, the letters not fully consistent with each other. The name written there was not mine. It said, Owen. Just Owen. No last name. I sat with that for a moment. Owen. Not Dale. The name was Owen, which meant. And I was aware of how much relief was in this thought it wasn't mine. Whatever this room was, whatever the accumulation of coincidences amounted to, the child who had lived here was named Owen, and was not me. I turned the page. The notebook was a journal of some kind. A kid's journal, probably 8 or 9 years old based on the handwriting. Entries that were only a few lines each, written in pencil on most pages, and occasionally in blue ballpoint. The entries weren't dated. They were brief and not particularly interesting in themselves, accounts of a baseball game watched on television, a complaint about a math test, a note about a dog belonging to someone named Terrence, who had apparently bitten someone at school. Normal kid stuff. I flipped through it looking for something that would tell me who Owen was, how old, when this was written. On the 7th page there was a drawing. Kids do this, fill journal pages with drawings when they run out of words. This was a pencil drawing of a bedroom, drawn from the perspective of someone standing in the doorway. The drawing showed a bed on the left wall, a desk under the window, a dresser between the closet and the corner. I looked up from the notebook. I looked at the room. The drawing matched the room, exactly the same layout as the room I was sitting in, which made sense. It was presumably Owen's room. He'd drawn his own room. But the proportion was off in the drawing. The window in the drawing was larger than the actual window. The desk was pushed further into the corner. Minor differences, the kind you'd expect in a child's drawing. Imprecision of hand, imprecision of memory. I was about to move on when I noticed something small in the drawing that I'd almost skipped over. In the drawing, on the baseboard under the window, there was a small dark mark. Owen had drawn the scuff mark. He'd included it in his drawing of the room, which meant it was already there when he lived here, which meant he didn't make it. He drew it as a feature of the room, the way you draw a crack in the wall or a stain on the carpet, but something that was just there, that had always been there. I thought about what that meant. The scuff predated Owen. Someone else had made it. Someone who, like me, had climbed out the window at approximately boot height and caught the baseboard on the way back in. I kept reading. Most of the entries were unremarkable. Then, about 2/3 through the notebook, the entries changed. The handwriting became more compressed, the letters smaller, the lines pressed harder into the page. The tone changed, too. Less reporting of events and more, I want to say, processing. Like the kid had started using the journal differently. One entry read, "The room is the same again." I measured it. Mom says I'm being weird, but I measured it, and it's the same. No context. No indication of what was the same or the same as what. The same as before, presumably. I read it twice. 3 pages later, I found the mark again under the window. I didn't make it. I know I didn't make it, but it's the same as before. Terrence says it's just a scuff, but Terrence didn't see the other one. The other one. Owen had seen another scuff mark somewhere. Another room. I turned the page. The next entry was longer, and the handwriting had gone careful in the way kids' handwriting does when they're writing something they consider important. Slower, and more deliberate. I'm going to write down what the same things are, so I have a list. The wallpaper is the same. The dresser is the same one. I checked the broken part inside the drawer. The window latch is the same. The mark is the same. Dad says the house has always been here, but I looked at the dates in the closet, and they're the same dates, and I don't understand why they're the same dates. I closed the notebook and set it on the bed beside me. The dates in the closet, the height marks. Owen had looked at the height marks in this closet and found dates that matched what? Matched dates from somewhere else. Matched dates from another room, another house, another set of marks that he'd seen before moving here. I was sitting in a room that at least 2 different children had experienced as a reproduction of a room they'd previously known. One of them was me, or so the weight of coincidence suggested, though I still hadn't fully committed to that sentence. The other was Owen, and Owen had done exactly what I'd done. Looked for the specific small details, found them, cataloged them, and been disturbed enough to write it down in secret. I thought about Gerald Maurer, 73 years old, no surviving family. Had Owen been Gerald's son, a grandchild, a child of a previous owner? The estate attorney had indicated intestate succession, which meant no documented next of kin. But that wasn't the same as no family. It meant no family who'd come forward, no family the bank could locate. People fall out of contact. Families fracture. It didn't mean Owen didn't exist somewhere. I pocketed the notebook. I know that's technically improper for estate documentation. Everything in the house is technically an asset of the estate until the attorney clears it. But the estate attorney was a bank-side functionary processing a file, not someone who would look at a child's composition notebook and understand what it was. I pocketed it, and I kept working. The rest of that day I spent on the downstairs, mechanically completing the intake while turning the notebook's entries over in my mind. By 3 in the afternoon, I'd finished everything that could be finished without the furniture removal crew, which I'd scheduled for the following week. I locked up, set the alarm on the lockbox, and sat in my truck in the driveway. I had a name, and I had a notebook. I had a set of observations that matched mine across what appeared to be at least 2 generations of occupants. I had a room that reproduced itself, or reproduced something with enough fidelity to unsettle 2 different people who'd lived in similar rooms elsewhere. I needed to find Owen. This is the part where, if I were a different kind of person, I might have stopped, filed it away, finished the job, sent the invoice, moved on. I'm not sure I can explain fully why I didn't, except that the notebook changed something. Up until the notebook, the room had been my experience strange, unsettling, personal. The notebook made it someone else's experience too. Another person had been here, had seen what I'd seen, had felt what I'd felt, and had tried to document it in the only way available to them, which was a $1.50 composition notebook under a bed. There was something about that I couldn't leave alone. I'm not going to pretend there wasn't also the more self-interested question, which was, if Owen had figured something out, I wanted to know what it was. I started with what I had a first name, a house, a deceased former occupant named Gerald Maurer. County property records are public. I pulled the full ownership history on the Carver Street property that evening from my laptop, the same assessor database I used for work. The house had passed through 5 owners since it was built in 1974. Gerald Maurer had bought it in 2003 and owned it until his death, so approximately 20 years. Before that, a couple named Sabo had owned it from 1989 to 2003. Before them, another couple from 1981 to 1989. And so on back to the original construction. None of the names meant anything to me. Owen wasn't a last name in any of the records, which meant either Owen was a child of one of these families, a first name that wouldn't appear in ownership records, or he'd lived here in some other capacity. Mauer was 20 years. If Owen was 8 or 9 when he wrote those journal entries, and if he'd been here during Mauer's ownership, he could be anywhere from late 20s to mid-30s now, or younger if he'd been here more recently. I typed Gerald Mauer into a general search. Obituaries came up. The local paper had run a brief 1-3 sentences, the kind they run when there's no family to submit anything more substantial. Survived by no immediate family. Retired. Formerly employed by the County Water Authority. No mention of children. I searched for Gerald Mauer in the county court records, looking for anything prior addresses, any legal proceedings that might mention family members. I found one thing, a custody matter from 2009. Partial records only, sealed portions, but the case header listed Gerald Mauer as respondent and a woman named Carla Piotrowski as petitioner, and the case type was listed as grandparent visitation rights. Grandparent visitation, which meant Gerald Mauer had at least one grandchild, and someone had gone to court to restrict or define his access to that grandchild. The case outcome wasn't in the public portion of the record. I couldn't see the child's name, but the filing date was 2009, and if the child in question had been, say, 8 years old in 2009, they'd be in their early 20s now. Carla Piotrowski wasn't a common name. I found a Facebook profile in about 4 minutes. I sat looking at it for a long time before I clicked through. It was a public profile, the kind people set up and then forget to lock down, and it was sparse, not frequently used. A profile photo of a woman in her mid-40s, a handful of posts going back several years. A son listed in the family section, first name only, visible to the public. Owen. I found his profile from there. 23 years old, living in a city about 2 hours from here, working at a print shop based on a tagged photo from what looked like a company holiday party a couple years back. His profile was more locked down than his mother's. I could see his photo, his name, his rough location. Nothing else. I wrote him a message that I rewrote 4 times before I sent it. I told him I was a property services contractor working on a foreclosure cleanout at an address on Carver Street. I told him I believed he might have lived there at some point. I told him I'd found something that I thought might belong to him, and I wanted to return it. I kept the message short, and I kept it factual, and I didn't mention anything about what I'd noticed in the room. Then I closed the laptop and went to bed, and lay awake for the second time in a week in the dark of my own bedroom, which was nothing like the room on Carver Street. My room was a room I'd chosen and lived in for 7 years, and it was full of my own accumulation of ordinary life. It was nothing like that room. I lay there, and I was glad it wasn't. Owen replied at 11:40 that night with a message that was 4 words long. Which room was it? Not which address. Not, I'm not sure what you mean. Not how did you find me. Which room? He already knew there was a specific room to ask about. He already knew the address on Carver Street would mean something. What he needed to confirm was which room inside the house. The question told me more than a longer message would have. I typed back, end of the hall, 2nd floor, the one with the blue wallpaper. Then I set the phone on the nightstand and waited. The reply came in 6 minutes. I can't do this over messages. Can you meet me? We arranged it for that Saturday. He'd drive to a town roughly halfway between us, a place called Minersville, and we'd meet at a diner he found on his phone. Neutral ground, public place. I didn't suggest these conditions, and neither did he specifically, but we both landed on them without discussion, which told me something about what we were both feeling. You don't suggest a public diner for a conversation you expect to be comfortable. I spent the days between in a particular kind of suspended state, that I'm not sure I can describe accurately. I kept going about my work. I had 2 other jobs that week: a small apartment clean-out and a post-estate garage, both routine, both manageable. I completed them. I talked to Marcus. I ate dinner, watched television, called my mother on Thursday, and asked her again about the box from my childhood, whether she'd had a chance to look. She said she'd found it in the spare room closet and asked if I wanted her to mail it. I said yes. I didn't tell her why. My mother is a practical woman and a good one, but this was not a conversation I was ready to have out loud with someone who had been inside my actual childhood bedroom on Fenwick Drive. Saturday, I drove to Minersville. Owen was already there when I arrived. He was sitting in a booth near the back, a young man with his mother's narrow face, wearing a gray jacket and holding a coffee mug with both hands, the way people do when they need something to hold on to. He looked up when I came in, and I could tell he'd been watching the door. He looked, more than anything else, tired. The specific kind of tired that has nothing to do with sleep. I sat down. We introduced ourselves. The waitress came and I ordered coffee, and we waited until she left. He said, "You found the notebook?" Not a question. I said yes. "I left it there on purpose," he said. "When we left. I put it under the bed in that room because I thought..." He stopped, picked up his coffee, set it down. I thought if someone else ever found it, it would mean something was happening again, and they'd need to know they weren't the only one. I said, "It was happening to me." He looked at me directly then. "Tell me what you noticed." So I told him. The furniture, the dimensions, the wallpaper, the scuff mark, the height measurements in the closet, the handwriting on the date labels. I told it the same way I've been telling it here, without embellishment, without claiming more certainty than I had. He listened without interrupting. When I mentioned the handwriting, he pressed his lips together and looked out the window for a moment. When I finished, he was quiet for a while. "How old were you?" he said. "When you were in that room, your original room." "I grew up in it, from birth to 16. "Where was it?" "Dillsburg, Fenwick Drive." He took out his phone and showed me something on the screen. I leaned forward to look. It was a satellite map view of a residential street, the kind of bird's-eye image that could be any neighborhood from any mid-sized Pennsylvania town. He'd drawn on it, or annotated it, somehow, added a pin. He watched my face while I looked at it. I recognized the street. Not Carver Street and not Fenwick Drive. A third street, somewhere else that I didn't know. I told him I didn't recognize it. "That's where I grew up," he said, "before my mom moved us, before we stayed with my grandfather for a year. That's my original room, the one I'd had since I was 5. Oak Street in Chambersburg." He took the phone back. "When we moved to my grandfather's house on Carver Street, my room was at the end of the hall. And it was the same, exactly the same," he said. "Same dimensions, same furniture, though my grandfather said he'd had that stuff for years, bought it at an auction in the 90s. Same wallpaper, and my grandfather said he'd put that up himself when he bought the house in 2003 because he liked the pattern. He'd found a roll of it at a salvage place. Same layout, the scuff mark." He paused on that one. "I know I didn't make that scuff mark. It was there when we arrived. I was 8 years old and I noticed it because it was in the exact same place as the one in my room in Chambersburg, and I know I made that one because I was there when it happened." Neither of us said anything for a moment. "There's more," Owen said. I waited. About 6 months into living there, I started having the same dreams I'd had in my original room. Not nightmares. The same ordinary dreams. The kind of dumb, low-stakes dreams, being at school, being in a store, whatever. The specific dreams I used to have in my room in Chambersburg. I'd had them my whole childhood. And then when we moved to my grandfather's, in that room, they started again. Exactly the same. I'd wake up, and for a second, I'd think I was back home on Oak Street. "You were 9 years old," I said. "Are you sure you're not?" "I'm sure," he said, without any heat in it. He'd clearly had the conversation with himself 1,000 times. "I know what you're going to say. I know how it sounds." But I kept the journal because even at 8 or 9, I understood that specific detail was strange, in a specific way that was different from just being homesick. Homesick is missing a place. This was the place coming back. I thought about lying awake in my own bedroom the week before. The relief of my ceiling, my walls, my accumulated ordinary life. I thought about what it would mean if that boundary wasn't reliable. If a room you'd left could follow you. "Have you been back," I said, "to your original room on Oak Street?" My mom sold the house in 2008, when we moved to my grandfather's. New family. They've been there for years. I've driven by. He picked up his coffee again. The current owners repainted the exterior and put up a fence, but the bones are the same. "Have you been inside?" He shook his head. I wanted to know first if it was still happening, if the room was still doing it. That's why I left the notebook. That's why your message mattered. Because if it's still happening in my grandfather's house, after he died, after the bank took it, after nobody's been living there, then it's not about the people in the room. It's about the room itself. I thought about the notebook impression and the desk dust, the clean rectangle where something had rested and then been removed before I could find it. I hadn't mentioned that to Owen yet. I did now. He went still. "When were you last at the house?" I said. "I haven't been back since my grandfather got sick. 3 years ago, maybe more." The impression was fresh. The dust around it was undisturbed, which means whatever left that impression was placed there and then removed in, I don't know, days, maybe. Not longer. "I wasn't there," he said. "I know you weren't there." He understood what I was saying. If he hadn't been there, and I hadn't been there, and the house had been vacant since February, then something had rested on that desk recently enough to leave a clean print in undisturbed dust, and then been taken. We sat with that for a while. The diner was getting louder around us, a Saturday lunch crowd filling in, and it felt surreal in the specific way that all ordinary public life feels surreal when you're in the middle of something like this. All these people ordering pancakes, the waitress refilling coffee, a child in the booth behind us complaining about something, and us sitting here talking about a room that reproduced itself across houses and decades. "I need to go back in," I said. "I have to complete the job regardless. The furniture removal is next week." "I know," Owen said. "I want to come with you." I should have said no. Looking back, the responsible thing was to say no, he wasn't on the work order. The bank's insurance wouldn't cover him. There was no professional reason to bring a civilian into a job site. But he was the only other person who knew what this room was, and whatever was going to happen when I went back, I didn't want to be the only one in it. I said yes. We agreed on Tuesday. He'd drive down in the morning and meet me at the house. On Sunday, I drove back to Carver Street alone. I know I said Tuesday. I changed my mind on Sunday morning without fully examining why. I drove over without telling Owen, without telling Marcus, without telling anyone. I had the lockbox code. I let myself in. The house was quiet in the way vacant houses are quiet. Not silence exactly, but an absence of the small sounds that living makes. No refrigerator hum. The utilities had been switched to bank maintenance mode. No settling noises, or rather the settling noises were more audible without the baseline of human habitation. I went straight upstairs. The room was unchanged. The impression in the desk dust was still there. I stood over it and I took a new photograph, and compared it to the one from earlier in the week. The same size, the same position, the same clean edges. Then I got down on my hands and knees, and I looked at the floor around the desk very carefully in the light from my phone. Dust on old hardwood floors has a record in it, if you know what to look for. The same way fresh earth records footprints. There were two kinds of disturbance near the desk. The first was mine, from my earlier searches. The drag marks from when I'd moved the desk slightly. My own shoe prints. The second was something else. Near the window side of the desk, there were two parallel linear disturbances in the dust, thin and precise, maybe 8 inches apart, and each about 12 to 14 inches long. The kind of marks that something would make if it had been set down and picked up carefully. Set down on the floor beside the desk, not on the desk surface. Like someone had placed something on the floor, crouched there, and then taken it away. I measured the marks with my tape measure. 12.5 inches long, approximately 8 inches apart. I stood up and I looked at the room. I had been in this room 5 or 6 times now. I had searched it carefully. I had documented it thoroughly. But I had not, until this moment, looked carefully at the wallpaper near the closet. Not the section where I'd lifted the loose seam to check for layers, but the section on the opposite wall, near the corner, behind where the dresser had stood before. I'd moved it during my search. The dresser had been against the right wall. I'd pulled it forward and checked behind it and found nothing. But in doing so, I'd exposed about 8 inches of wall that would otherwise have been hidden. I hadn't photographed it. I hadn't looked at it closely. I'd noted there was nothing behind the dresser and moved on. In that 8-inch strip of exposed wall, the wallpaper was different. Not a different pattern. The same pattern. The same blue geometric maritime or compass point, or whatever the pattern was called. But the paper in that strip was newer. Not slightly newer, the difference was visible. The rest of the wallpaper had the yellowing and slight brittleness of paper that had been on a wall for at least 20 years. This strip was clean, still slightly off-white, flexible at the edge where it met the older paper. It had been put up recently. Within the year, I'd guess, maybe closer than that. Someone had repapered behind the dresser, replaced a section of the original paper with a matching piece. There was only one reason to do, that something had been on the wall there that they needed to cover. I pulled the dresser further out from the wall, all the way, scraping it across the hardwood floor until the full section was exposed. The new strip was about 18 inches wide. I got my utility knife from my work bag, the one I carry for box cutting and carpet scoring, and I scored the edge of the new paper carefully. I wasn't thinking too hard about the estate documentation implications at that point. I peeled the new section back from the bottom up. Underneath, the original paper was gone entirely, just the bare plaster. And on the bare plaster, written in pencil in a child's handwriting, were 2 columns of names and addresses. 20, maybe 25 entries. Some in the same hand, some in different hands, as if more than one person had written on this wall over the years. Some entries were faded almost to illegibility, old pencil, going pale on old plaster. Some were clearly newer. Each entry had a name, a street address, and a year. I found Fenwick Drive in the list, my street, with a year that would have been during my childhood. I found Oak Street in Chambersburg, Owens Street, a different year. And at the bottom of the list, in the newest handwriting, in pencil that was still dark and clear, was an address I recognized. It was my current address, the house I own now, the house I've lived in for 7 years, with a year written next to it. This year. I stood there long enough that my knees started to ache from crouching. I straightened up and looked at the wall, and I did not take a photograph. I want to be honest about that. My phone was in my hand, and I did not raise it. I don't know exactly why, except that photographing it felt like a different kind of acknowledgement than just seeing it. It felt like carrying it out of the room in a form that could be shown to other people, made into evidence, and I wasn't ready to do that yet. I read the list again instead, slowly, top to bottom. The oldest entries were barely legible. The pencil faded to a gray whisper on the plaster. I could make out partial addresses, fragments of street names, years going back, one that might have said 1987, one I couldn't date at all. The handwriting on those oldest entries was adult handwriting, not a child's. Careful, deliberate printing, the kind of hand that had been taught penmanship. The middle entries were a mix, some adult, some clearly younger, uneven letters, the numbers not quite uniform. Owen's entry was in a child's hand that I recognized from the notebook. Mine was the only current year entry, and it was in a hand I didn't recognize at all. Not a child's hand. Not Owen's. Not any hand I could match to anything else in the house. An adult's handwriting, neat and unhurried, like someone who had all the time they needed. I pushed the dresser back against the wall. I left the peeled section of wallpaper loose. Hanging at the bottom, I couldn't re-adhere it without materials I didn't have, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. Then I went downstairs, sat on the front steps, and called Owen. He picked up on the second ring. I told him what I'd found. I read him the list as best I could remember it, not all of it. I hadn't memorized it, but the structure of it, the 2 columns, the names and addresses and years. I told him I'd found Oak Street. I told him I'd found Fenwick Drive. I told him about my current address at the bottom with this year next to it. He was quiet for a long time after that. "How many entries total?" he said. 20, 25. Hard to count exactly. Some were too faded. Going back to when? The oldest I could read said 1987. There might have been older ones below that. I couldn't tell. More quiet. Then, so it's been doing this for at least 40 years. Not someone has been doing this. It's been doing this. Owen had already made the leap I was still standing at the edge of. The one where the room stops being a passive location and becomes something with its own continuity, its own record-keeping, its own reach. He'd had 15 years to make that leap. I'd had a week. "The address at the bottom," he said. "Your current house." "Yes? You haven't noticed anything yet. At your house." I thought about that. My bedroom, my ceiling, the relief I'd felt lying in it, the specific gratitude for its ordinariness. I thought about whether I'd been noticing it clearly, or whether I'd been making a choice not to look. "I don't know," I said. "You need to look," Owen said, "before Tuesday. Go home and look tonight." I drove home. The drive was 40 minutes, and I spent most of it doing what I'd been doing all week, which was running the logical frame over the facts and checking where it held and where it didn't. The list on the wall implied a long history of this. 20-plus houses over 40-plus years, maybe longer if the faded entries went further back than I could read. Each entry a place where someone had lived in a room that the room on Carver Street had, what? Reproduced. Echoed. Claimed. Maybe. Though that word felt more dramatic than I wanted. But my current address being on the list changed the geometry of it. The other entries were past tense places where people had previously lived, rooms that had already been replicated. My address was this year, present tense, which meant either the room was documenting something that had already happened in my house without my awareness, or it was documenting something that hadn't happened yet. I got home at a little after 4 in the afternoon. The light was still good, that low April light that comes in at a sideways angle and makes dust visible in the air. I stood in my front doorway for a second before I went in, just stood there. looking at my entry hall the way I might look at a job site before I started, trying to see it fresh. Everything looked normal. My coat on the hook, my boots on the mat, the small table with my keys and wallet. I walked through the downstairs first. Kitchen, living room, the spare room I used as an office. Everything where I'd left it. Everything mine. Accumulated and familiar and ordinary in the specific way that your own things are ordinary. You stop seeing them. After a while, I went upstairs. My bedroom was at the end of the hall. I had not thought about that until right now, standing at the bottom of my own stairs. My bedroom was at the end of the hall, second floor, right side, the same position as the room on Carver Street. I went up slowly. I stopped at the top of the hall and looked at the 4 doors. Bathroom, linen closet, second bedroom I used for storage, and at the end, my room. I had lived here for 7 years. I had chosen this house, negotiated the price, signed the papers, painted 2 of the walls myself because I'd gotten tired of the rental beige. This was my house. I knew every room in it. I pushed open the door at the end of the hall. My bed was on the left wall. It had always been on the left wall. That was just where the outlet was, and where the room made sense. My desk was under the window. I had put it there because the light was good for working in the evenings. My dresser was between the closet and the corner, because that was the only configuration that left enough clearance for both the closet door and the bedroom door to open without hitting each other. It was the only logical furniture arrangement for a room of this size, 11 feet, 2 inches by 12 feet, 4 inches. I didn't need to measure it. I sat on the edge of my bed, and I looked at the room I'd slept in for 7 years, and I tried to remember choosing the furniture arrangement. I had chosen it. I could remember the afternoon I moved in, Marcus helping me carry the bed frame up the stairs. The 2 of us standing in the empty room, figuring out where things went. I had chosen to put the bed on the left. I was sure of that. I could see the memory clearly. But I had also grown up with a bed on the left wall. And Owen had grown up with a bed on the left wall. And 20 or more other people, going back 40 years, had apparently lived in rooms with a bed on the left wall, and a desk under the window, and a dresser in the corner. Some of them before Carver Street existed in their lives, and some of them after. And at some point, the question of whether we'd all independently arrived at the same practical arrangement ceased to be a question about furniture. I stood up, and I went to the baseboard under my window. The scuff mark was there. I had always thought I made it moving the desk in during a rearrangement 2 or 3 years ago. I had a specific memory of the desk leg catching the baseboard. I had a memory. Standing here now, I could not fully trust it. I touched the mark. The paint was slightly raised at the edge the way old scuffs are, the kind that happened years ago and dried that way. It didn't look 2 or 3 years old. It could have been there since before I moved in. I looked at my closet, the folding door, the cheap, hollow core kind that almost every house of this era and price range had. I opened it. On the inside face of the door frame, low near the floor, there were pencil marks, 6 of them, in a vertical progression. I had put those there myself. I remembered doing it. I was going through a phase of trying to track things after a doctor mentioned that adult height fluctuates, and I'd gotten curious. I'd measured myself once a month for about half a year before I got bored of it and stopped. My own measurements, my own handwriting, my own dates. I crouched down and looked at them with my phone light. The dates were right. The measurements were right. The handwriting was mine. But the marks went lower than my height measurements should have. Below the lowest one I'd made the first one. From when I started the project, there were older marks. Fainter, shallower in the paint. the pencil lines thinner. 3 of them, lower on the doorframe, sized for a child. No dates on those, no labels, just marks. I had not put those there. I sat on the floor of my closet for a while. The folding door was half open beside me, and the room was quiet, and the light from my phone made everything look very specific and close. I thought about the list on the wall at Carver Street, my address this year. I thought about what it would mean to understand this completely, to know what the room was, what it wanted, why it kept finding people and becoming their room and leaving its marks inside their marks, living inside their houses like a layer of wallpaper under wallpaper. I thought about the composition notebook Owen had left under the bed for whoever came next. The deliberate act of that. A 9-year-old kid deciding that documentation was the most honest response available to him. That if he couldn't understand it, he could at least leave a record for the person who came after. I thought about the 20-odd names on that wall. Each of them had sat somewhere the way I was sitting now. Each of them had arrived at this same point, this same crouched stillness with the evidence right there under their hands, and they'd had to decide what to do with it. Some of them had written on the wall. I thought about that. Writing on the wall felt like a kind of answer, not to the room, but to the other people on the list, acknowledging the chain, joining it deliberately instead of just being part of it, passively. I had a pencil in my work bag downstairs. I could go back to Carver Street and add something. My address was already there in someone else's hand, but I could put my name next to it. I could write Fenwick Drive, 1988 to 2004, in my own hand and make the record complete. I didn't do it. I'm not sure I can explain this fully either. It felt like a line I didn't want to cross, not because I was frightened of the room, or not only that, but because I wasn't convinced that participation was the right response. Owen had left the notebook, and I understood why. But the notebook was for people, for the next person who needed to know they weren't alone. Writing on the wall felt like it was for something else, like it was feeding a record that the room was keeping for its own purposes, and I wasn't ready to contribute to that voluntarily. I texted Owen that evening. I told him what I'd found in my closet. I told him I wasn't going back to write on the wall. He replied, I didn't either. I thought about it, decided against it. Then, after a pause, the furniture removal is still Tuesday? I said yes. I still want to come. He came. We met at the house on Tuesday morning with the hauling crew I'd brought in for the heavy work. I introduced Owen to Marcus as the deceased's grandson, which was true, and Marcus nodded and put him to work carrying boxes, which was the right call. Owen worked steadily and didn't say much, and by noon we had the downstairs cleared. We went upstairs together in the early afternoon, just the two of us, while the crew took a break. The room at the end of the hall was bright with the blinds up for the first time, probably in years. The blue wallpaper looked older in direct light, faded in the patches where sun had reached it through the blinds over decades. The furniture looked like what it was old, ordinary, worn. We got the dresser first, slid it out from the wall carefully, and we both looked at the exposed section without speaking. The loose wallpaper was still hanging at the bottom where I'd peeled it back. Owen knelt down and looked at the wall for a long time. He ran his finger along one of the lines on the list, his own entry, I think, his Oak Street address, without touching the pencil marks, just the plaster beside them. He stood up, and we moved the dresser to the hall for the crew. Then we came back, and he looked around the room one more time, and I let him. He stood in the middle of it the way I'd stood in it, taking it in, and his face was doing something complicated and quiet that I didn't look at too directly because it felt private. He said, I used to think it was trying to trick me when I was a kid, like it wanted me to get confused about where I was. I didn't say anything. "I don't think that anymore," he said. "I think it's more like I think it just does what it does, and we assign the intention. We're the ones who make it mean something." I thought about that. I still think about it. We finished the room. The furniture went on the truck. By 3 in the afternoon, the room was empty, bare floors, bare walls except for the wallpaper, the closet empty with its folding door standing open. The height marks were still on the door frame. I photographed them for the estate documentation, listed them in my notes as pre-existing markings on interior millwork, not significant enough to flag as damage, which was accurate. The crew patched a nail hole in the master bedroom wall. They swept. They loaded the last of the boxes. Marcus locked up and returned the key to the lockbox, and we were done. Owen and I stood on the front walkway while the crew loaded the final items. One of the oak trees had dropped something on the cracked concrete, a small branch, a few dry leaves. The afternoon had gone gray and cooler. He said, "What are you going to do about your house?" I'd been thinking about that since Sunday. "I don't know yet," I said. "It's my house. I'm not leaving it because of marks on a door frame." He nodded like that was the answer he'd expected. Then, "When you look at your room now, your bedroom, does it feel different?" I thought about the right way to answer that. "It feels like mine," I said. "It still feels like mine. It just also feels like something else's." He looked at the house. "Yeah," he said. "That's it exactly." We shook hands in the driveway. He drove south, I drove north. I don't know if we'll talk again. We might. There are 20-some names on that wall, and some of those people may still be living in their rooms, and I think about that more than I expected to. The box from my mother arrived 4 days later. A small cardboard box, taped carefully the way she tapes everything. Inside, a report card, a school photograph from 2nd grade, a birthday card I'd made her when I was 7, and a single folded piece of lined paper at the bottom, creased and soft from years in a box. I unfolded it. It was my handwriting. Young, uncertain, the letters not quite consistent. A list of my bedroom measurements from when I was 14, written on a piece of notebook paper I'd carried in my desk drawer for weeks before I lost it. 11:2 by 12:4. My mother had found it somewhere and saved it without knowing why. She'd carried it through 2 moves across 20 years. I folded it back the way it was and put it in my desk drawer. I didn't throw it away. I don't know why. It belonged somewhere, and for now, this is where it is. I still sleep in my room at the end of the hall. I still wake up in it every morning, and it's still mine. My walls, my ceiling, my accumulated ordinary life. I haven't moved the furniture. I haven't looked too closely at the wallpaper in the corner behind the dresser. I think about Owen's word. Also, it feels like mine, and also something else's. That's the most honest thing I can say about it. I've made a kind of peace with the also. I'm not sure I had a choice. Last week I took a job in a neighborhood about 20 miles from here. Routine clean-out, standard intake. The referring agent mentioned it was a 4-bedroom colonial, older construction, 2nd-floor room at the end of the hall. I took the job. I don't know what I'll find when I get there. I think that's the point.